Alrighty, well, I guess we got to get to the topic, the topic of Xjet and FPV dying. And I say that a little bit dramatically because FPV died a little while back when Pavel Spikowski, the INEV dev, pointed out that FPV was dead. And a few years before that, Pavel also said that FPV was dead. Somewhere in between there, I think Bruce said FPV was dead or dying. And what happened? Let's start with the background, Blunty. What did Xjet do? He's in the chat. He can tell us if he thinks we got it wrong, but we're not going to actually call him up and put him on because that's not how we do the news. What did he say?
So basically, he made a video about a chart, and that it was basically a chart that it turns out was created by a third-party think tank, the Eno Center for Transportation. I just want to say that like Bruce did make a follow-up video about this, explaining that he understands that it is not from the FAA, but I do want to, like, that's kind of why we're talking about this. So yeah, essentially, so this chart, it was scary to a lot of people that read it.
Because I've got the chart up right now.
Yeah, if you read it, it basically splits us into CBO and non-CBO hobbyists. So in a way, essentially, they want to split us so that if you fly under the rules of the CBO in your FRIA, then you're fine because you're flying under rules. Mm-hmm. And then if you're flying in a non-CBO, not under the FRIA and everything, that they want to have other licenses and rules for your FPV and things in that airspace.
And specifically, what this chart seems to say is that if you are a non-CBO hobbyist, basically means you're not flying according to the AMA safety rules, then you cannot do FPV. That's what this is. A little hard to read here, but that's what this chart says, which freaked some people out because they watched Bruce's video, and whether this is what Bruce meant to convey or not, but people said the FAA is going to outlaw FPV unless you have a Part 107. But there are several reasons why that isn't accurate.
Yeah. And so, so mainly because this is from a third party. So this was information that basically this Eno Center, it came together and decided this set of safety rules that it wants to propose.
Well, who is the Eno Center?
It's just like a third party think tank that is presenting information to the whatever the current version of the ARC committee is. I can't ever remember the name of it, but it's basically the committee that looks at all these drone rules and tries to decide what they want to submit to the FAA to be like, here's what we're going to do, or here's what we should do. And then the FAA is going to decide based on that, and then what it's doing, like how to move its rules along time.
Yeah.
Right. So there is some influence here possibly, but the thing to consider here is that this is a separate company providing a set of things that they completely came up with. And they're proposing this set of things to this group and eventually the FAA.
Well, and so as we know, the FAA always listens to the ARC's recommendations, he said sarcastically, because the ARC made recommendations about remote ID, which were completely ignored by the FAA, and they just came up with their own thing.
Yeah, before the final rule, they got together and did this big committee where they had all these like outlines and guidelines, and they ignored 90 to 95% of that and made their own rules, basically. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons I would say, like, this isn't really something we should be super concerned about. However, I do understand the reason to bring it up. However, my opinion on it would just be that, like, maybe we should take the time to look at the webinar, like, because they did a webinar that this original video was about, and that they have like a whole document.
If only someone had watched, if only someone on this very webcast had watched the webinar and knew what else was in it. I didn't. Yes. Did you?
I did. Yes. Yeah. So essentially,
no, how convenient.
Yeah. But really, my point of view here is just that, like, if you consider what they're saying, I think we should be looking at what they're saying and rebutting what they're saying.
Absolutely.
Because if you take a look at what they're saying a lot of the same things we are, but they're drawing different conclusions than our industry draws. So if you look at what they're saying, they say, hey, we often talk about there's no risk assessment, right? We say all the time, like, why isn't there a risk assessment? That's one of the reasons we're suing the FAA, to say, like, you're doing this without any guidelines or any reasoning because you never did this risk assessment. But what they're saying is, because there was never a risk assessment done, we're more vulnerable to over encroaching law if something happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that. There should have been a risk assessment. There's no basis for the laws except that somebody pulled them out of their ass.
And so their point of view is, if we make laws that are less strict than we think will happen if an accident happens, then we can counteract this overreach by the government that will happen. So I think it's important to like take a look at their proposal and then look at what they're doing and then kind of decide, like, instead of just brushing them off and saying this is ridiculous, I think we should take a look at it and go like, hey, where are they coming from? Why are they saying this? And how can we better like push this into the right direction? Because I think overall their like concepts are okay. Like their ideas behind what they're trying to do are like kind of the same thing we talk about. But unfortunately, I think the conclusions that they draw here are stuff that a lot of us would not draw, and it's over encroaching for what we would do.
Yeah, I was surprised when I saw this chart, because until now, when I originally saw this chart, it was handed to me by a random person on the internet who said, have you seen this thing from Xjet? And they said, here, this chart is from the FAA. And I was like, really? And it makes a distinction between a Part 107 and a recreational hobbyist pilot. And currently, hobbyist pilots must always fly within the safety guidelines of a CBO. So the idea that the FAA had even considered acknowledging a non-CBO hobbyist, I was like, wait, that's a real sea change. Like, we haven't heard anything like that. And I'm not saying that would be good or bad, but I was like, wow, that's interesting. But go ahead.
I was just going to say, so just real quickly, the reason they're doing this split and the reason that they're like saying that they want to have the split is just because if you consider anybody under a CBO would be liable under that CBO. So because you're flying under the rules of that CBO, the guidelines that the CBO has presented you, you signed a document under that CBO and the CBO is following under the FAA. Their opinion is that if you're flying inside of that CBO, inside of that FRIA, not, all with all their rules, then you're at least under the guidelines of some organization.
Okay.
And their point of view is
does that transfer liability to like the AMA if you do something dumb?
I'm not sure, actually. To be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure how the like legal liability lays there. But I would assume if you're flying under those, ordinances, then they can't come and get you for violating a law if you're following the laws that they set to you, right? Yeah. So what they're saying is like, if you're not in the CBO and you're flying long range and you're a recreational pilot, how do you know you're safe? And so their point of view is that we can prove to the government you're safe by making you take a license test. And so then when they come back and say like, hey, you fucked up, you flew too long range, you shouldn't do this, blah, 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 blah. Instead of just saying like, hey, there's a piece of paper you looked at on the internet and you could have or could have not printed out. You actually had to take a license test to do this. And that gives more liability on the person and less liability on the system to be over encroached on later. Again, I don't agree with much of this stuff. Like some of it I agree with and some of it I don't. But I do think it's important to like consider this point of view because I don't think it's the last time we'll see it.
So I think my take on this is that Bruce is 100% right to be paying attention to this stuff and to point out that this could happen in the future because these people do have the ARC's ear, and maybe the ARC will ignore them, or maybe they'll be like, yeah, that sounds really good. And I'm thankful that someone is bringing this stuff up. At the same time, to say that this is a done deal, which I'm not saying that Bruce said that, but many people, I got say, let's say 10 or 20 emails from people saying, did you see this video Bruce made? Oh my God, now we can't fly. And I know that no matter what you say on the internet, someone will take it the wrong way. But I also know that Bruce can be a little bit dramatic sometimes. I don't know how to say it politely. I mean, he's seen this stuff happen before, though. So for all we know, he's going to turn out to be right, and we're all screwed. And he was the Cassandra that we wouldn't listen to.
So I kind of made a comment on one of his videos, and basically my opinion of it was like, hey, listen, the sky might end up falling, but like we've got to figure that out, like, and reason out why it's going to fall before you tell everybody it's going to fall. Because then nobody's going to fucking believe when it falls. It's the same thing that happens in Chicken Little or The Boy Who Cried Wolf or whatever. Like you may have a valid point, but you got to wait or got to get the right information out at the right way, I think, to like actually get these people to listen, or they'll just never listen. They'll just never click on that headline. And part of this discussion we're having now is because of that. Like, we want to let more people know and talk about what's actually happening and have that discussion. So also we've linked to that webinar. It is now available on YouTube. Now that it's aired. So if you wanted to go watch that webinar, it's like 45 minutes and it discusses their point of view on safety. Maybe you can have some rebuttals or that sort of thing.
So let's shift gears though, Blunty. Let's shift gears. Is FPV dead or dying?
Not currently.
Is it going to die?
Hopefully, no.
Raven 187 with a $2 super chat says FPV is technically already illegal in Australia. Hey, you Aussies, do you fly FPV? Is it dead?
So it depends. It depends on what you consider dead. If you consider dead legally hard to do or impossible, then maybe. But if you consider FPV dead as like, are people doing it and is it alive and well? I think it is. I think plenty of people are doing it regardless. Like long range has never been legal. Flying without an observer has never been legal. Flying without your ham in most cases isn't legal. But people are doing it all over the place. So more regulation, I don't think necessarily kills it. I think it's about the people and what they can do.
Xjet says people are not listening. That's the problem. Look at how little we as a hobby are doing to protect our freedoms. Registration was just the start, as I predicted. That's a tough one because I'm not sure. I mean, we got so many comments on the remote ID NPRM, a historical number of comments compared to how many comments NPRMs usually get. And here's remote ID. So, I mean, people did come out in, I think part of it is that we're just such a small hobby that even when we come out in large numbers, it's not enough to get a signal above the noise.
Yeah, I know Bruce has said previously that they've ignored a lot of that stuff or backed off on it so they can add it later so that it looks better for us now. But, all we can do is go by what we've seen. And if you go by their final rule at all and you look at the listed comments on how they responded to them, I do think there was some give a shit there that they had. Yeah.
I mean, Xjet says 53,000 people out of how many in the hobby? I mean, how many people are in the FPV hobby? Let's try to figure it out. Whenever I try to think about the size of the FPV hobby, I go back to a number I once heard about the Betaflight user base. The Betaflight devs know about how many people have downloaded and are using Betaflight Configurator and Betaflight. And the number that I've heard thrown around is the low single-digit hundreds of thousands. Now that's Betaflight users, which is not all of FPV, but I would feel extremely confident based on that, saying that there are less than 1 million global FPV like hobbyists, pilots, less than 1 million, probably less than 500,000. At that point, if we got 53,000 comments, technically that was just the USA, although many people outside the USA weighed in. It's a pretty good freaking number, considering how hard it is to mobilize people about this kind of thing.
Yeah, I would agree.
Anyway. Yeah. I mean, I guess the takeaway is that people who say the sky is falling are right in some sense. The changes from not being regulated at all to being regulated some are unfortunate. The long-term consequence for the hobby, I think, is difficult to predict.
Yeah.
And saying, this is it, this is the end. Because people email me and they say, well, now that these regulations are here, I guess I was thinking about getting into FPV, but now these regulations are here, I think I'm not going to. And I'm like, don't do that. Like, I mean, I guess it's up to you, but yeah, it's not like that. We're all just having a good time doing our thing. We'll see if it changes in the future. I would rather see, I'm not sure that saying this is the end of FPV every 3 months. I'm not saying that Bruce does that, but I'm not sure that saying everything is the end of FPV. I think that's not an effective way to mobilize people that we need. I'm not sure what is an effective way to mobilize people, though.
Well, there's a question of like, are you going to catch extra people because of something different? Like, I don't know. But I know when I watched the video, I would have preferred to see a rebuttal of the Eno Center's research, like what their article was and what their points were. And that's what I would have hoped from that. And that's sort of where I want to go with it. Instead of just like, again, we're not accusing, but I'm just saying, unless it's just randomly ranting about stuff or saying like, hey, this is a thing, let's go off about the industry. Let's instead like break down the thing. Like I keep thinking
it's the difference. It's the difference between saying the building is on fire, the boat is sinking, and saying get a hose, get a bucket. One is constructive,
this
and
part of
one
the
is
building is
not.
on fire, and here's how it got on fire, and let's talk about how to put it out.
I think
yeah.
Interesting.
Because like the more you keep talking, the more I keep thinking like that 45-minute thing I saw in the Eno Center asks a lot of the same questions we continue to ask in the rest of this conversation. They've addressed a lot of these things, you know. Somebody in the Discord has talked about having a risk assessment is a great idea, but something they talk about in this Eno Center thing is it's really hard to do a risk assessment when nobody's registered, nobody logs anything, nobody has any requirements. So how do you do a risk assessment, and how do you prove that long range is safe if you can't prove that long range is safe and you can't
do long range legally at all?
Yes. Yeah. So it's one of those things where, like, again, like I want to see rebuttals and talk about all these topics because they've clearly spent the time in a room to go over all this stuff and have all their shit in a row.
Yeah.
And it makes me think a lot when I listen to it. So love to get the other side.
I think maybe one of the things that I'm hearing you say from watching the whole presentation is that Bruce's take of this one slide represents a threat to FPV, we should freak out and get our pitchforks, actually missed a lot of potentially other interesting content if you had dove deeper into the whole thing.
Anybody who doesn't know about drones and watches that presentation will come away with the idea that we need more regulation and it is not safe. And so my point of view is that we need to watch that and critique it and understand what they're saying and why they're wrong, or if they are wrong, because there's going to be a lot of people who watch and take in that information. If they do, again, it's not got that many views, but who knows who will see it, if a committee or other people see it. It's just a lot of information that is hard to rebut immediately. And it sounds very easy to hear because it's a company. It's a think tank meant to do this. So.
Right. All righty. Well, I will say thank you to Bruce for bringing it to our attention. I didn't know about this presentation. This presentation did go to the ARC, or whatever they're called these days, and the FAA will have heard it. And we definitely want to know these things are coming down the pike. It's not a given that it will come true, and there are definitely, but we also definitely should be taking action to fight it. And one way you could do that is to donate to the Race Day Quad's legal GoFundMe. Not sure what the other ways are these days. Anyway.